On his blog, Tim Challis tells the story of 400 sheep who fell to their death by following the leader. It happened in Turkey, and where he was at the time, the little English-speaking paper decided to put a little snippet to record the incident for whatever reason. And so the article reads like this: 400 sheep fell off cliff in Turkey. That's the title. Istanbul. Hundreds of sheep followed their leader off a cliff in eastern Turkey, plunging to their deaths this week while shepherds looked on in dismay. 400 sheep fell 15 meters to their death in a ravine in Van Province near Iran, but broke the fall of another 1,100 animals who survived. Newspaper report said yesterday, shepherds from Ixler village neglected the flock while eating breakfast, leaving the sheep to roam free, the Rockadell Daily said. The loss to local farmers was estimated at $74,000. I don't know about you, but that article is shocking and strange and amusing all at the same time. I don't know if you can picture the scene, but apparently one of the sheep decides, you know what, I think I'm going to walk off this cliff. And now all the other sheep said, you know what, that seems like a good idea. And so they began to walk off the cliff, the whole herd of them, all the flock of them. And they just went boom, one over the other over the cliff. 400 of them died, mounting up a pile of sheep, one sheep after the next. And eventually the sheep on the top, they're just landing on pillows down below because it's all sheep. So I guess the first 400 sacrificed themselves for the 1,000 plus that came after them. Sheep are dumb. Now, sheep don't normally commit suicide, but they're dumb. They tend to follow the leader. They're committed to a leader, so committed that they're going to follow that sheep leader even to their death. Now, we look at the story and scratch our heads, and it's kind of funny, but it's kind of not. It certainly wasn't amusing to those shepherds. We can look at the sheep and say, well, how dumb can you be? But at the same time, they're dumb sheep. You can't blame the sheep. Who do you blame? You blame the shepherds, who in neglecting the sheep, they went off to themselves and they had a breakfast together, and at some point somebody started hollering about what was happening, and they ran out and looked in disbelief as one after the other. Their whole herd went off the side into the ravine. Kind of brings to mind the passage that I preached about last week about Jesus, who saw the crowds. And he had compassion upon them because they were harassed and they were helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. You see, sheep, they need shepherds lest they do dumb things. And Jesus calls his people sheep. It kind of stings. But at least if I'm called a sheep, I get to be called one of his sheep. And I'll take being one of his sheep any day. When you look in the Gospel of John, in John 10, John records an incident where Jesus makes the comparison between his followers and sheep, and Jesus describes himself as a good shepherd. We are starting a brand new series as we go into the fall, and it's called X Marks the Spot. Sometimes in discipleship, as we're trying to follow Jesus, as we're trying to figure this whole thing out, you get a lot of advice. And there's a lot of, well, you do things this way or you do things this way. There's a lot of, well, you gotta do this and there's just a lot of noise in all of this. And so through the series, I just want to lay down some foundational pillars as we talk about this journey with Jesus so that we don't get lost along the way. Like we have a map to this whole thing in Christ. And X marks the spot. Where are we going? Well, the answer is Jesus. Jesus is the spot. Jesus is where we're going. There's an awful lot to this journey, but if we can keep that in mind, we'll be doing okay. Being a disciple following Jesus is about following with relentless passion and determination Jesus, who is the center of our life. He marks the spot. In this passage, Jesus describes himself as a shepherd. He describes himself as a door or a gate. And he describes himself as the doorkeeper or the gatekeeper. And when you look at this passage, it may be a little bit confusing, but we'll sort it all out. John chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. And I'm only going to read down through verse 10. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." The text is a little bit confusing because Jesus says he's a shepherd, he's a door, and he's a doorkeeper. Well, for us, it's kind of hard to wrap our minds around this. It's like, Jesus, what are you in this passage? But with a little bit of background, it becomes easy to sort out. See, in the ancient world, these sheep pens were basically just stone enclosures. And they just kind of wrapped around. They were just an enclosure typically made of stacked stones that held sheep. And the shepherd would take his flock and he would lead them in through an opening in this stone enclosure, this stone pen. And so all the sheep would go in and lay down and find rest there. And there's anecdotal stories of this period that oftentimes these shepherds would then sit in that opening, that they would sit down as the gatekeeper, as the door to the pen. So the shepherd would often sleep there as the door, that no one would go in or out except through that door. And if they did, that shepherd would know. Now, there were people who would come and they would try to steal sheep. And they would have to go over the walls of the pen because the shepherd with his crook and his staff was sleeping at the door. He was the doorkeeper, the gatekeeper of the pen. Jesus makes this announcement, and in context it's fairly clear. If you want to come into the people of God, if you want to come into the place of security, if you want to come into the place of safety, if you want to come into the place of belonging, then the way to do that is through me. There's no other way to come into the pen. Jesus tells this story, makes this statement when he's in Jerusalem. And most likely, based on the context, if you look in chapters 8 and 9, or even if you look on into chapter 10, most likely Jesus is saying this in the context of one of the festival days of Israel. He's there in Jerusalem, and it is a time of celebration. Most likely it's either the Feast of Tabernacles, that's chapters 8 and 9, or it's the Feast of Dedication, which crops up in later on in chapter 10. Both of these feasts were centered around the temple. They were celebrated in the temple, and they were celebrating that the God of Israel, the one true God of all the universe, had come and lived among his people. He had moved into the neighborhood. And in the mind of an ancient worshiper, where does God live? Well, he lives in the temple. And so they would go into the gates of the temple and rejoice at their belonging as people of God. They had these feasts, and they would come from all over the countryside. And they would go to Jerusalem, and they would enter into the courts. They would come in through the gates where they belonged and where they were safe, because that was where God dwelt. They rejoiced that they belonged to him. And within this sanctuary, they had safety, they had peace, they could worship him, they could fellowship with him, they could be a part of this community. In the midst of this upstart named Jesus says, if you want to be right with God, if you want to come into the sanctuary, if you want to come into the place of safety and belonging, it's not the temple gate. I am the gate. I am the way in before God. I don't know about you, but that's pretty bold. That's a pretty wild declaration in the middle of these feasts. Why would Jesus make such a statement? It seems almost out of context. It seems almost like he would get in there and just sort of thumb his nose at everybody else, just to thumb his nose at everybody else. I'm the way to God. Until we do a little bit of looking and we venture back into chapter 9 and we read the story about a blind beggar. A blind beggar that Jesus had healed. A blind beggar that had been rejected from the temple. A blind beggar that had been ostracized, who was considered a sinner and an outcast. And all of a sudden, Jesus comes along and he heals his eyes and tells him to go and present himself. And so this blind beggar, he goes and presents himself, and they question him. Who healed you? It was on the Sabbath, by the way. They didn't like that. And so they question him. Who did this? How did this happen? The same people question him who had rejected Jesus. The same people who had pushed this man out of the temple were the ones who were rejecting and pushing Jesus out of the temple. They chased him down. They interrogated him. They interrogated his parents, trying to figure out who did this. And the only thing he could come up with was, I don't know, but I was blind, and now I see. Told him that he believed that this person, this Jesus, must be from God. And so they kicked him out of the synagogue. They barred the door and said, you can't come in. Now, a synagogue isn't the temple, but it was like the little temple there in the community. They kicked him out. And here Jesus, in the context of these festivals and this blind beggar, he says, they can't kick you out because I've invited you in. They can't shove you out. They can't bar you because I'm the way in to God. Anyone who comes to God, they have to come through me. If you want to access to the one who made you, who created you, who knows you, who knew you before you were born, if you want contact with him, you got to come. You enter through me. If you want to belong, well, I'm the way to belong. I'm the gate. I'm the entry point. Jesus is the shepherd, the doorkeeper, the door. And Jesus is the very beginning point of our understanding of what it is to walk this thing of discipleship out. Discipleship is completely built around Jesus. Some of you are looking at me saying, well, obviously. But sometimes I think in church it's not so obvious. Because a lot of times we can get busy doing a lot of things. We can get busy doing a lot of things in life. We can get busy doing a lot of things trying to find our way to God. But if we're going to pursue discipleship, it begins with this understanding that we are pursuing this Jesus. That our way to right standing before God is not our church attendance record. It's not our Sunday school record. It's not how much we give in the offering plate. That our right standing before God is met in Jesus. Does he know us? Do we know him? Have we come in through the gate? Jesus is at the center of our discipleship. All the things that we do must point us to him. We have devotion, not so that we can check the box, not so that we can know the Bible really well. We have devotion so that we can know Jesus really well. We don't pray so that we can just put a check mark beside it. Oh, I had my 10 minutes of prayer this morning. I prayed on my way to work. Check, I'm done. No. We have our prayer so that we can relate to Jesus. Jesus is the entry point. Jesus is the way that we have access to God. And that is a crazy, bold statement even today. You see, we like to have our churches neat and clean. Don't you like coming in and seeing vacuum lines in the carpet? Amen. I do. They call me crazy, but I look at that sort of thing. I like that things are neat and put together, and I like for things to be organized, and we like our worlds to be this way. But the thing is, at the middle of our face is Jesus, and he is sometimes messy. Because there in the organized world of the Pharisees, where everything was talked about and was written down and was line by line codified, this is how you do in this situation, this is what you do in this situation, this is how you behave here, this is what you do here, this is who you need to talk. All these things were codified and laid out. In the midst of this, Jesus calls a blind beggar who had been kicked out of the synagogue, and he says, I'm the gate. Come in by me. I don't know about you, but I've been more like the blind beggar in my life than I've been like the proper Pharisee. I'm glad that Jesus calls broken people. I'm glad that Jesus calls people that other people have rejected. I'm glad that Jesus calls people who've been barred out of other places, that Jesus calls whosoever will. And I was one of those whosoever wills. At the middle of discipleship, as organized as we want it to be, as pretty as we want it to be, as plain as we want it to be, there's Jesus. And when we follow Jesus, it's not always clean and organized. It's not always perfect and laid out. You see, the shepherds would lead their sheep sometimes through some rough places to find some good pasture. The shepherds would lead their sheep sometimes through some dangerous territory to find fresh running water. And their safety depended upon their allegiance, upon their hearing the shepherd's voice and following him. The middle of our discipleship is Jesus. He is the good shepherd. He's the gate. He's the door. We are disciples of Jesus. This morning, you're not disciples of Brian. Thank God you're not disciples of me. You're not disciples of Irving. You're not disciples of Kyle. You're not disciples of John Hagee or Jack Hayford or any of these. You're disciples of Jesus. And it's His voice that we need to hear. It's His voice that we need to follow. X marks the spot. Where are we going? I'm following Jesus. I'm following the Good Shepherd. I won't turn back. John gives 5 truths about Jesus as the Good Shepherd, as the doorkeeper, as the door that relate to our journey toward God. If you want to know God, you have to know Jesus. You understand that? If you want to know God, you have to know Jesus. John gives us 5 truths about Jesus as the shepherd, doorkeeper, door that relate to our journey toward God. 1, Jesus is the door of access. Jesus is the door of access. He makes the point that both the shepherds and the sheep have to come in by the door, by the gate. There's no other way. Jesus plainly reveals himself as the door. He is the way into the sheepfold. He is the way into safety. He is the way into belonging. He is the way into the people of God. He is the way into the right standing of God. There is no other entry point. Every other way is a thief and a robber, and they will be denied. This is a truth that the early church maintained. Would do well to maintain it today. The early church, Luke, proclaimed this. He said, "And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." There is no other entry point than Jesus. If you want to know God, you have to know Jesus. People will look in all kinds of places. We will look into all kinds of things, all kinds of avenues. Churchy people will pursue all kinds of churchy things to find their way to God. But we must have Jesus. Always Jesus. Any relationship with God must begin, listen to me, and continue in Jesus. The story here reminds us that Jesus is the door of provision. The Good Shepherd meets the needs of the sheep. Jesus meets our needs and He sustains us. He met our greatest need, and that was forgiveness and cleansing of sin. But not only that, He meets our needs, our other needs in this world. He is the Good Shepherd. He ministers to us. He takes good care of us. He knows the kind of food that we need to eat. He knows the kind of places where we need to lay down and find rest. He knows where the good watering spots are. He knows the right place to take us for nourishment. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, sustains us. He is the entry point to provision. He's the door to provision. Jesus is your provider. Not the wolf, not the robber, not your parents, not your job, not the government. Jesus. Not only is He the door of sustenance, the door of our provision, Jesus is the door of our protection. Not only does He sustain, He protects. How many of you like to feel safe? Why don't you feel safe? The shepherd would bring the sheep into the pen and lay down in the entryway. It's almost like, I dare you come in here and mess with these sheep. Jesus is the door of protection. He protects His sheep from thieves and robbers and other enemies. Whatever reason in the ancient world, people would steal sheep, maybe for meat or maybe for wool or maybe to help supplement their herd or whatever. But it was a real danger in the ancient world. Probably still a real danger today. And the shepherd had to be on their guard to protect the sheep. Well, we don't have any old shepherd. We have the shepherd, the Good Shepherd, who is protecting His flock. He's able to keep us in where we're safe. Sometimes we like to push against the gate and try to go our own way. But Jesus knows how to bring us into a place of protection. He keeps us in and He keeps the thieves and the predators out. There are times in life where you feel scared. There are times in life where you feel attacked. Nothing can come to you without going through Him first. That attack on your life, nothing can come to you without going through Him first. Jesus is not only the door of our protection, He's the door to life. How's your life? Sometimes I feel like we just live, and that's about all we do. We just exist. That's not the kind of life that Jesus has for His sheep. Not just a life of existing. Jesus offers us life, a living relationship with the one who created us. And that makes sense. Because John, in his gospel, in chapter 1, describes Jesus. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. That Jesus in Him is life. It makes sense that He would provide, that He would be the door to life for us. If you feel like you're just getting by, Ask the Lord for life, real life. He doesn't want to just give you penance to help you get by. He says life abundantly. The thief has come to steal, kill, and destroy you. I've come that you would have life and have it abundantly. Have it to the full. Not just a meager existence, but abundant living. Life that is fulfilled and filled in Him. He's offering us the best. And He secured it with His life, His blood. And it's not just for someday. Someday Jesus is going to come back. He's going to take us out of this old cruel world. Yeah. He came to give us life, not just for someday, but He gives us abundant life now. That in this life, in this place where you and I walk, we can have His presence, His power, His might moving and working in us. Life today, not just tomorrow, but life through our days. Is the door of excess. It's not just plain old life, but it's abundant life. I don't mean excess garbage. I mean excess good. Jesus wants to bring abundance to us. Abundant living to us. Not just living, but abundant living to us. Jesus is the more than enough God. He has everything. He doesn't want us to just get by. He wants to lavish us with His love and His life so that we live in this place of overflowing. The word abundant there, it means an extraordinary amount, profuse, going beyond what is necessary. That sounds awesome, doesn't it? That our God is a providing God that goes beyond what's just necessary. That He's kind and He's generous. That He will lavish on His people. He goes beyond what's necessary and He overwhelms us with His inexhaustible grace and provision. In an extraordinary amount, abundant, profuse, beyond what is necessary, more than enough, matchless, overwhelming. That's Jesus. He says, I'm the door. If anyone enters me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. At the center of our walk with God, in the center of our being, this whole thing of church and Christian life begins and continues with Christ. That we exist through Christ. That we can get hung up and caught up with a lot of different things, but Christ is where we're going. Christ is the center. Christ is the direction that we're walking. He's the one that we're following. He calls us. He gives us all we need. He keeps us from evil. And our job is just to know Him. Our busyness centers around knowing Him. It centers around being able to discern His voice from the millions of other voices that are all around us. We can get hung up on a lot of things. But if there's anything to be hung up on, it's Jesus. He's the good shepherd. He's the door. He's the gatekeeper. You don't need to earn your way before God. You never could. He calls to the broken. He says, come in through me. I'll make you whole. This morning, just let all the excess wash off. All the stuff we get preoccupied with. Just for a few seconds. Let all the have-tos just plop down, puddle in the floor. Let all the I wish I coulds and I ought tos, let them just flutter away. And let's focus on Jesus, the Good Shepherd, the gateway, the door, the one through whom you and I come in and out and find pasture, where we find rest, where we find peace.